The biggest problem that's confronting us is insulin resistance.
Right? I agree with that.
Too much, way too much sugar and obesity and all that goes along with it. But insulin resistance it's just devastating. It makes you old, it makes you diabetic, it's terrible. It interferes with your cognition, it increases the probability that you'll get Alzheimer's. And that's all linked to carbohydrate excess intake, right? You agree with all that?
I agree with that.
Okay, and yet, when you were in high school, one of the first things you did to begin your political career was agitate for a, reduction or stabilization of the price of cookies at the school?
We were against cookie inflation.
Yeah, so looking back from your position of wisdom 13, 14 years later, what do you have to say to the American public about your cookie advocacy?
What I should have been advocating for, reduction in the hamburger or steak prices. You see, that would have been a much better health approach. But all kidding aside, the funny undercurrent of that is that's kind of what started my political advocacy.
I know,
and
it is hilarious.
I kind of look back, even just 13 years ago, when cookie prices were the number one concern. This was before DoorDash. This was before all that. And I look at these high school kids now, what they're able to order into high school. They have entire cubby rooms of like half of the high school class that is just getting takeout. So in our high school in the suburbs of Chicago, the biggest thing was these basically homemade cookies that nearly tripled in price over the course of a year. So we started Students Against Cookie Inflation, which was a rather righteous effort, I might say.
How old were you?
I was, at that time, 16, 17 years old. 16.
And how much before that do you think your interest in the political developed?
I definitely had an interest. I'd say I was really fascinated by American history, why we were a great country. It was hard to not be politically oriented or opinionated based on the time that I grew up in. Understand the time and place. When I was in 8th grade, this guy named Barack Obama came onto the political scene from Chicago, and everybody had an opinion about him. In fact, he became...
Where were you at the time?
I was in the suburbs of Chicago. Wheeling, Arlington Heights area.
Yeah, okay.
And Obama was a homegrown, which he really wasn't, but he was, a senator from Illinois, a homegrown, almost quasi-messianic political figure. I mean, you remember how it captured the nation times 10 in the Chicagoland area. Remember, Obama did his victory speech in Grant Park in downtown Chicago. That's where he celebrated his victory in 2008. And so it was just an all-encompassing, almost, political moment where it was at very high social cost to be disagreeable with the rise of Obama in 2008. And mind you, I was a 7th or 8th grader at the time, and actually going into 9th grade.
Okay, I met you. Do you remember when we first met? Was it 2016, 2017?
I think it might have been 17, 18. I came to Toronto because and still to this day, this is correct, I was so moved by your lectures and your videos that they significantly changed my life. And I really wanted to meet you more than anything else. And
well, I remember
you were kind enough to make time for that.
Yeah, well, I remember that meeting. I remember trying to figure out who you were because of what you were doing and the fact that you had this remarkable organizational capacity. But what I'm interested in now is what I'm very interested in trying to figure out what inclined you to take the path that you took. Now, you said, so you said Obama, but you said something else at the same time. You said that you had been reading American history, and that you were concerned with, interested in, and convinced by, I suppose, all of those, this issue of what made America great.
Correct.
Okay, so now, so this is interesting and worth taking apart. For decades, the typical pathway for someone young who was assessing the history of his or her country would have been to read it through a highly critical lens. So, for example, I remember when I was 13 or 14, I was reading Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. They were more like radical literary figures, I would say. But the mid-70s ethos certainly was to read history, sociology, critically. And I don't mean you were being uncritical. I mean to take an anti-establishment stance.
Yes.
Like in the 60s, that was all, anti-establishment, free love, the sexual revolution is coming, everyone's going to be free. By the time the 70s came along, which was the milieu I was embedded in, all of the optimism of the 60s had pretty much vanished. Now you, though, interestingly enough, in Chicago, and this would be mid-2000s, so quite
2008,
a bit later.
2009.
Right, near the end of the the first decade of the 2000s. You were reading American history, but your take was positive and patriotic.
Correct.
So why? Why do you think that was? Like, what do you think what made you different? Why do you think that your political rebellion took a conservative form when that isn't, it's not common for young people, and it certainly wasn't the pattern of the time from, say, 1965 till, well, probably till about when you were adolescent.
That's a phenomenal analysis and question. Let me just add to it. The literature, the non-political, non-historical literature that we were being assigned was what I call pre-woke. It was almost there. And so it was like books that come to mind is a book called like Things Fall Apart. Basically, the entire premise of the book, based on my memory, is that there are this wonderful tribe and they all get along in Africa, and these evil colonialists come in and things fall apart and there's internal strife. And the end of the book is basically the summary of all of these relationships of these evil colonialists that say, and here's the history of just the sub-Saharan Africa, basically dismissing all of the complexities and the beauties. The discussions we'd have in class were very much anti-colonialist, anti-Western, that we are the contaminants on the world, that we are polluting other tribes. And again, mind you, that we're in 8th or 9th grade discussing this, so I don't know what post-structuralism is or postmodernism is, but it was pre-woke.
Did you spend any of the time when you were studying slavery assessing the fact that the UK was the only country that's ever existed in the history of the world that spent, 2 centuries and a tremendous proportion of its treasury eradicating slavery around the world at the behest of Protestant Christians?
Correct.
Because that's the story.
And I never remember knowing the name Wilberforce.
Wilberforce, yeah. See, this is a very interesting thing. I actually didn't come across, this is so strange, but life is very strange. I didn't come across the name Wilberforce till I was probably in my 40s.
Isn't that amazing?
It's beyond comprehension.
I didn't get to know him until the last 5 years. I might have heard it, but not until someone looked at me seriously and said, you have to study this guy. This is a preacher. This is a man of faith that led to the abolition of slavery probably in the entire...
Under impossible conditions.
Exactly.
He devoted his whole life to it. And the link between that and the religious ideation is rock solid.
It's one-to-one.
It's one-to-one. I've learned a lot of things in the last 10 years that have shocked me so bad I don't know how to recover exactly. And one of them was that the public school system was set up by fascists on the Prussian military model. I've never been able to figure out exactly what to do with that. They were literally trying to make thoughtless worker drones.
Desk workers. That's what bureaucrat means.
Yeah, well, or factory workers.
Correct, that's right.
And what that in itself wasn't so bad because the country was industrializing, but right underneath that was the idea that while you were doing that, it was necessary to pretty much stamp out or fail to develop anything that would produce any kind of creative entrepreneurship.
And so when I was in 9th, 10th, and 11th grade, something in me, and I don't quite know, my parents very patriotic, but not political. Patriotic, but not political. They're conservative, but we were not a political family, but very patriotic. Something in me desired to try to find the other side of the story, to try to push back a little bit from the incessant narrative that was being built. And I do want to make sure this is clear. We were not yet at the place where the teachers were saying America was racist. I could make, at least in my environment, I could make an argument though, that what they were doing when I was in high school is actually long-term much more effective to create revolutionaries for the left than what they're doing now. They weren't saying to the white kids in class, hey, go sit on this side of the class, and black kids on this side of the class.
Yeah, well, those things always happen one tiny step at a time.
Of course, but when I was being schooled, there was no parents showing up at school board meetings about critical race theory. Now, these elements were laced throughout all of the curriculum.
Right.
And it took a very discerning eye. And for whatever reason, how I was raised or just something in me, around 10th or 11th grade, I asked the question. I said, look, we have spent an entire month on slavery. Totally get it. Terrible thing. but we spent so little time on the brilliance of the founders and what they've created and the greatest political document in human history and what went into that. And it was an underemphasis on the heroism and the courage and the brilliance, and an overemphasis on the evil and the tragedy and the horror without even the redemption arc behind it.
Yeah, well, the thing that's so awful about that, as far as I'm concerned, from the leftist perspective, let's say, is if you are concerned with the poor and the oppressed, and then you have to be discerning there, because there are people who are poor and oppressed as a consequence of their own idiocy. Given that there are people who are unfortunate, you'd think that the appropriate tack would be to determine who in history served them most effectively. And I just can't see anyone you could possibly point to more effectively, who did that more effectively than Wilberforce, ever. And so you would think that instead of erecting monuments to Lenin, the leftists would erect monuments to Wilberforce. But not only do they not do that, no one knows who the hell he was.
It's one, it is one of the greatest memory holing of a hero in Western history.
Yeah.
I completely agree. Why is it? My hypothesis is he's Christian, is that you cannot highlight a man of faith who did something with such valor and such significance. It is at odds with almost every other fundamental narrative that they must try to present.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's right, that it is fundamentally, but that begs another question. Why, given that Wilberforce was clearly a force for the good that Obama, for example, would have been pushing, polity where there was no racial or ethnic prejudice. If Wilberforce is the poster boy for that sort of effort, which if you understand his life and you read about it, I can't see how you can conclude that, then why would the lefties forego that merely to oppose the fact that his motivation was fundamentally Christian? Because that points to something deeper, right? It points to the fact that the true war, so to speak, isn't political. It's not left versus right. It's something deeper. And then if it is anti-Christian, then why? Like, what does that mean? Like, there's an Enlightenment element there, right? The Enlightenment types, especially after the French Revolution, generated this narrative that science and religion were radically opposed, and that if you were on the side of religion, you were against clear, rational, logical thinking. And so you could imagine a stream of anti-Christian sentiment emerging on the rationalist side, right? But it isn't obvious to me at all that the leftist types who don't talk about Wilberforce are anti-Christian because they're scientific rationalists. No
way.
All you have to do is talk to them for like 15 seconds and you find out that that's not the case. They might use those arguments from time to time, but they certainly don't apply the rigors of scientific thinking to their own radical hypotheses. So it's deeper than that. And so what is it exactly that they're objecting to? Is it the fact that the more radical leftist story, Marxist, let's say, is in its essence anti-Christian, which I think is a fair statement, but why would that be more important? This is the strange thing. Why would that be more important than serving the poor and fighting for the abolition of slavery and all of its associated prejudices? Because it still doesn't get you out of the conundrum, which is why not Wilberforce? Instead of tearing down statues, why not erect statues to him? Yeah, so, well, I know that's a hard thing to sort out, but you got any, obviously you were feeling something this in high school,
that's
right?
Correct.
You guys are throwing out the baby with the bathwater here.
Correct.
Yeah, which baby exactly?
So my initial thought is that the leftist types, the ones that really understand it, they do not seek to achieve actual liberation and actual eradication of evil.
Yeah.
I hate to say it, I think they just want to be in charge.
There are a group of people, 4% of the population, and then there's still a fringe around that would maybe be another 5% where you'd have to take it seriously. And so they're in the psychiatric diagnostic literature, they fall under the cluster B heading, okay? They're histrionic, which means they're dramatic, And I suppose if they're healthy and histrionic, then they become actors, right? And entertainers. So there's a positive spin on that. But if they're negative histrionic, they dramatize their pathology and use it as a weapon, okay? They're narcissistic, which means they want unearned social status. They're psychopathic, which means they're predatory parasites. And they're antisocial, and that's just your standard criminal types. So that all fits in cluster B. Then there's personality traits that go along with that. Machiavellian, they use language not to convey information, but to manipulate instrumentally for their own purposes. So if I'm speaking with you in a Machiavellian manner, I have a goal in mind that has nothing to do with the words that I'm using. You may have talked to journalists like that many times.
Many times.
Yes, many times.
So
okay. So they're Machiavellian.
That's so well said.
They're narcissistic, again, that's an overlap. They're psychopathic, oh yes. And on the personality side, that associates with sadism. And so all of that culminates in a personality style that has the proclivity to take positive delight in the unnecessary suffering of others. Okay, so now those people, they're 4% of the population. They look for a story that's working. Could be Christianity, Judaism, Marxism, could be conservatism, doesn't matter what the story is. They look to see where it has purchase. So where the people who play that game have power. They infiltrate that, they advertise themselves as the vanguard of that movement, and they do that for no other reason than to gain power. Now they'll guise themselves in political cloaks, and they'll learn all the tropes. I mean, this sort of thing, you can see this sort of thing emerging like mad on the right, on Twitter, for example. But it's been characteristic of the left for a long time, insofar as the left has power. But you are the one who just said, I think they want power.
Yes.
That's part of that. In the biblical tradition, there's a battle always between the ethos that brings abundance, Luciferian usurpation of power. Right, that's the temptation that Christ is offered in the desert, right? The third temptation is the temptation of power.
Right, the whole world.
Moses is punished brutally by God for using power near the end of his...
And for thinking he has the power to actually make water come out of the rock.
Well,
not
yeah, that it's dependent on him.
That's on him, not God.
Yeah. Well, and worse than that, not only on him, but on it, God tells him to invite with his words, and he uses force and authority. Right, so he doesn't enter the promised land. So that's a good indication of the danger of power, even when wielded by someone who is estimable, right? Because you have to give Moses his due.
A lot of credit.
There's a commandment not to use God's name in vain. And then there's the comments in the Gospels about the Pharisees, right? The Pharisees are exactly the people who use religious terminology, so moral terminology, to cloak their power-seeking machinations, right? And Christ goes after them. I think the best account of that is in Matthew, where he tells them that they're like...
broods of vipers, yeah.
Worse, they're like graves full of rotting bodies that someone whitewashed. Had they been alive in the time of the prophets they purport to follow, they would have been part of the mob that would have killed them. Right, that's actually part of, you may know this, but that's part of what sets them up for the crucifixion, right, because they're not very happy with those insults publicly delivered. But that shows you also how old the problem is. So you can imagine one of the worst possible sins is to take the highest possible virtue and then to gerrymander that so that your standing for that only pushes you towards power. By their fruits you will know them, right? So you look at, well, what I've done is I looked at the consequences, for example, of the green energy programs in Germany and the UK. Well, what's the consequence? Let's take Germany. Germany pollutes far more per unit of energy than they did 10 years ago, and their energy prices are 5 times as high. They're completely dependent on dictators of the worst sort.
Yes.
They continue to make the same mistakes. They're deindustrializing very, very cataclysmically.
Nature worshiping is not anything new. All throughout the scriptures.
No, that's right.
Elijah, is that whole story is a manifestation of the nature worshipers versus the belief in God. But back to just to reiterate a very profound point you made. In evangelical circles, we get wrong, which is people think do not take the Lord's name in vain, just to say do not say God in an expletive way. It actually, the word is don't carry the name's Lord, the name of the Lord in vain, meaning don't do actions in the name of God. So you're exactly right. And so people wear the costume of the holy, or they appropriate.
Well, that's exactly what Christ tells the Pharisees. Literally, he says they wear the garbs of the priestly to elevate their moral status.
And this is what we believe is partially blaspheming the Holy Spirit, which is to take all of the trappings of religion.
Oh, that's interesting.
And to do evil in that name. We believe that is one of the, if not the most evil.
So that you think that's the transgression against. So my psychological understanding of the idea of the Holy Spirit is that the Holy Spirit is what possesses your words when you truly aim up. And this makes sense to me psychologically because the thoughts that make themselves manifest to you spontaneously are directly related to the intent of your aim. That's how literally how your verbal mind works, your imagination as well. You know, if you go on a date and you aim at sexual contact on the first date, the fantasies that come along with that aim will be of that nature, obviously. And if you are on the hunt, so to speak, for a marital partner, the fantasies that accompany that will be quite different. But it's definitely the case that your aim determines what comes to mind. Now, you said that sin against the Holy Ghost, which is the unforgivable sin, is the sin that occurs when you use the Lord's name in vain. So when you claim to be motivated by what's divine, but are actually serving the Luciferian spirit of usurpation and power.
Right. Think about how much damage those evil priests did.
Oh, yeah.
That's a great example.
Look, most of the people that I've spoken with who proclaim themselves to be atheists are atheists for two reasons. First of all, they tend to be tilted in the engineering cognition direction, so they're much more oriented towards things than people, and that's a stable temperamental trait. They've almost all also invariably been hurt by someone or some institution that's claimed to be religious.
That's right.
Obviously betraying someone. There's no worse form of betrayal than betrayal that's done in the name of the highest good. I thought that sin against the Holy Ghost was rejection of the Abrahamic call. Go out into the world, leave your zone of comfort, move away from your people, and have the terrible adventure of your life. If you reject that, you can't develop.
Yes, and think of how many young men are rejecting it.
It doesn't take that much encouragement for the people you're describing to be inspired to try. Now, I've talked to thousands of young men who've had that experience, like I see a lot of them at my lectures. They come to the meet and greets, for example, and they tell me, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, because it's starting to be a long time now, 8 years ago even, they were not in good shape. And they came across my lectures or books and decided that there was something worth aiming for, and then decided to try. To take on more responsibility, and they usually laugh about starting to make their bed or something like that, which is a lot less trivial than people think, and then it's straightened them out. The terrible thing is how little encouragement that actually took. Why are people coming out to see you on campuses, and what kind of response do you get from the people that you talk to?
The responses have been incredible. First, the crowds alone, we're drawing crowds of 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 people in the middle of the day just for me to debate a random college kid or a college professor. It's remarkable.
So walk me through one of those events, Charlie.
And so I've been doing that for a decade. As we know, we started Turning Point USA. One of the things I really wanted to make sure is that I was in touch with the target audience that I was trying to convince and trying to persuade. No better way to do that than just go to the college campus itself, set up a card table with a poster that says, I think government should be smaller. I would do this when we had almost no funding, no connections, no idea what I was doing. I've always believed in the grassroots interaction. So I've been doing that for many years, and then Stephen Crowder, to his credit, kind of popularized this idea of debating and putting it on. I said, why don't I also film these interactions? And so I started to do that around 2018. So it's been about 7 or 8 years now. And, then 10 kids would show up, and then 20 kids. And we started to put these on the internet, and kind of concurrent and simultaneous to your rise, where you diagnosed what was going on in the West quicker and more accurately than anybody else, especially with young men. We started to see our popularity increase as we started to address some of the underlying problems that young people were facing, but in particular, young men were facing. And then COVID happened, and we were basically out of business for, a year, in the sense where we weren't able to do campus activities. Donald Trump was no longer in office, and we had to really kind of rebuild on campus. basically about 2 years ago, so let's just say the spring of 2023, things really started to change, where we would do these campus events prior, and we would bring in your traditional conservatives, 300 to 400 people, maybe a couple 100 interested types, maybe 50 liberals, 500 students, call it a day. That's a success. All of a sudden in 2023, we were drawing a different type of person and student. First of all, we were drawing people outside of the campuses that were welders, electricians, and plumbers, and the working men that heard that we were in town, and they just
How'd they hear?
Social media.
Okay.
And so decentralized promotion. And so they would show up. And I saw that. I mean, these were guys that would go up to the question line, and they were not asking about Rousseau, or they were not asking about Jacques Derrida.
Yeah.
They were saying, how do I be a better person? Young men, especially, that were seeking purpose and seeking a destination. They're looking for direction. They're looking for connection. They're also looking for validation, not meandering through life.
Yeah.
Not having, the aimless despair of walking in circles. There is something happening with men that no one is talking about, no one wants to acknowledge, no one wants to admit. We must diagnose, why is this happening? The education system is hyper feminine. There's no place for young men.
You had an intuition that you could go to campuses. Where'd that idea come from?
Well, I never went to college. I've been to more colleges than most people. I've either given a lecture, a speech, or started a chapter there. I wanted to go to West Point. I didn't get in. I told my parents I would take a gap year. He said, Charlie, you shouldn't go to college. He said, you have to go create. You have something in you. You have a drive. You have a passion. I took the gap year. And that's where my job on campuses became far more interesting, because our organization shifted from primarily, economic discussions of Marxism and capitalism to core cultural hotbed topics in 15, 16, 17, race. And then, of course, the next layer, gender, transgenderism. So the beast that Betty Friedan and Judith Butler raised, that monster, reared its head with incredible ferocity in 16 and 17 in the academy. And people don't believe it when I say this. I saw this happen. No, it's okay. Just really quick. In 2012, 2013, there was almost no transgender anything on these campuses. It didn't exist. I could tell you, I went to these campuses. I talked to these students. You might have an effeminate looking guy maybe wearing a dress as a joke. It was not anywhere. The social contagion within 5 years was dramatic. It was a different place. You went from just, okay, you are who you are, to you're not going to use my pronouns, hyper tyrannical, hyper authoritarian. So then here we are, a 5-year-old organization with a growing infrastructure and a growing presence and a growing staffing, organization. And we multiplied significantly, because then the donor types, like, hold on, what happened to my alma mater? Why is it that they're burning down UC Berkeley? Remember, Milo Yiannopoulos went to University of California, Berkeley in the spring of 17, and they burnt the whole place down. Ben Shapiro very similarly. And so we then found ourselves accidentally or through serendipity on the front lines of the American culture war.
Tell me how you started going to campuses and what you did to begin with and how you got away with it.
So the first person who wrote us a check was a guy by the name of Foster Fries, amazing philanthropist. I met him very early on. This was August after I graduated high school. And I just had this idea to try to bring the conservative agenda to young people. I met him in a stairwell at the Republican National Convention. I gave him a stairwell pitch. I said, well, here's 5 ideas that I have. He laughed, he chuckled, gave me his business card. He said, be in touch. Send me $10,000 the next week. That was like,
how did you know that there was such a thing as finding donors? And what do you think it was that set you up to have the gall to assume you could do, first of all, to know that that was a thing, and then to have the gall to pursue it?
The second one, I don't know. I don't know where I got the gall to pursue it. I will say Bill Montgomery, being a mentor of mine, was very encouraging towards me.
Okay. So you had someone encouraging you.
Yes. But
and you said he saw something in you.
Yes, and he was
and he was an entrepreneur.
Yes, and he never asked for anything from me, which was very unique. It wasn't like he was trying to have some agenda. He was 72 years old.
So you had a mentor, which you desperatly need as a young person, definitely. And someone who believes that you can do it.
And you think about it, you're 18 years old. You don't know how to cash checks. You don't know. You barely know how to put on a tie. Literally, I didn't know how to tie a tie for the first 2 years. At Turning Point. Again, my parents are phenomenal, and they deserve a lot of credit. But this was kind of a beyond the upbringing, where an external mentor comes in and kind of points you and says, hey, I think you're really good at this, found a skill, identified a skill, and kind of molded me in that direction. And so I started to do research. I said, well, are there things such as external nonprofit political organizations? Oh, there's a 501c3 or there's a 501c4 and you can raise money. And so the first couple months was me actually learning, what am I building? Am I building?
So you were training as an administrator and a manager then too?
I was everything for the first.
Yeah, of course.
I was CEO, I was janitor, I was everything.
Yeah.
And so I had to make a decision. Of course, I asked for advice. Am I going to start a for-profit company? Am I doing we decided on nonprofit, largely because we believed that there was an untapped pool of philanthropic dollars that wanted to see these campuses challenged and disrupted.
It's very interesting to see where you started and what you're doing and where you're headed. And I enjoyed the conversation very much. Yep.
Thank you.